Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our CareConnect Convo with Dr. Melanie Mouzoon from Kelsey-Seybold. We're going to wait just a few minutes before we go ahead and get our conversation and discussion started today. We know that everyone's logging in on Zoom, and sometimes we have a little lag with technology or internet connection or some issues connecting. And I see we do have a few people starting to log in. But we'll do some housekeeping before we start our official presentation. So again, thank you to all of you who have joined us today for our CareConnect Convo. I'm Lane Galata, a marketing team member here at Kelsey-Seybold. I'll be your moderator for today's discussion with Dr. Mouzoon. So we definitely want you guys to ask questions. Dr. Mouzoon is such an amazing resource here at Kelsey-Seybold for vaccines and immunizations. And we want everyone to make sure that you submit your questions through the question and answer box at the bottom of your Zoom screen or the chat feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Whichever you're more comfortable using, go ahead and use that. We do only have about 35 minutes with Dr. Mouzoon today. So if we have questions that aren't answered, we'll make sure we either get them posted in the FAQ section on our Kelsey-Seybold website. We have a COVID-19 FAQ section, or we'll send out a follow-up email to y'all with answers to those questions. So let's see, we have quite a few people logged in now. So Dr. Mouzoon, thank you so much for joining us today. Do you want to give us a little bit of a background about your experience at Kelsey and what you're doing with COVID-19 and the vaccine?
Okay, so I'm a general pediatrician, and that seems a little weird for me to be talking about a vaccine that's not yet approved for pediatrics, but I've been involved in Kelsey-Seybold's vaccine system, basically as a managing physician in charge of all our vaccine policies and sort of the answer person for all the vaccine questions that Kelsey-Seybold physicians have for a number of years, since 2001 for all physicians. And so I really have a lot of experience from attending conferences, national vaccine conferences and national immunization conferences, as well as just years and years of experience in answering questions and looking up the information and being aware of the best practices. And along with that, the national immunization conferences always cover pandemics, particularly influenza pandemics, but all kinds of pandemics. So it's given me some background in that area as well. So I'm happy to answer your questions and just want to kind of go through with you what vaccines are and how we can, why we are encouraging people to get the COVID vaccine and how we can all get out of this pandemic situation.
So I'm going to go ahead and share our presentation with you guys today. We will hold questions until the end. I see some of y'all have already submitted them, so thank you. We'll get to those at the end of our presentation, but I'll let Dr. Mouzoon go ahead and start presenting to y'all.
So I first wanted to talk about what a vaccine is. So you can go to the next slide, Lane. So our bodies have this wonderful ability to recognize foreign proteins, non-human proteins, and they do that all day long. They do that in your nose and throat as well as in your bloodstream. Your body has a system in place, the immune system, to determine what belongs in your body and what doesn't. So germs and viruses and bacteria of various kinds all have protein coats, and the vaccines are actually copies of those protein coats so that the body can learn to recognize those copies of the pathogen or the serious germ, their protein code, so that you can develop immunity to that protein before that germ ever enters your body or makes you sick. Older vaccines, some of them are killed or weakened germs. The whole germ, like the whole cell DPT vaccine I got as a child, was just the pertussis germ, the whole thing killed and included in the vaccine. Some vaccines are weakened viruses. For example, the MMR vaccine is a weakened version of measles, mumps, and rubella viruses, all concocted together to give you immunity to all three illnesses in one shot. But newer vaccines are imitations just of the coat, and they're very pure proteins. So most germs have a number of different proteins on their coat, and we become immune to all of them, but immunity to just part of a protein coat is sufficient to protect you from the illness. So newer vaccines are just copies of the protein coat without the contents, no DNA, and the vaccines teach our immune systems to recognize those coat proteins, so we eliminate that germ from our body before it makes us sick. Next slide. So, the question arises for people, what is this messenger RNA vaccine, and is it going to change my DNA? Messenger RNA is made in our bodies all the time. It is basically like a little stencil copied from our DNA that then allows your cells to make proteins. And lots of different proteins are made this way. All proteins are made this way, in fact, in our body. Hemoglobin and myoglobin and myelin and keratin and all the proteins, collagen, all those things are made in our body through the intervention of messenger RNA, which copies a little piece of our DNA and then creates the structure that is a template for the protein to be built. And messenger RNA's vaccines take advantage of this process by just introducing a little piece of messenger RNA into your cell so that the cell will make the spike protein for the COVID virus. And because messenger RNA is a short-lived molecule, it has to be short-lived because you don't want to make too much hemoglobin or too much keratin or whatever your cell is busy making. It's a very short-lived protein. It goes away in relatively short order. And so once your body has made some of the spike protein and develops immunity, the messenger RNA disappears. It never has to go into the nucleus of the cell in order to instruct the cell to make the spike protein, so it doesn't alter your DNA. Next slide. So the surface protein, that spike protein we've all heard so much about, is then taken up by cells in your body called dendritic cells, which produce the protein and then take it to a lymph node and present it to your immune system. And this vaccine is known for causing some swollen glands in your armpit because you get the shot in your arm, and sometimes those drain to your armpit, and sometimes they can drain to your neck or just above your collarbone. And so that's actually a sign that your body is responding to the vaccine if you get a swollen lymph node, and that your body is making antibodies and learning how to make them make immune responses into the future with a different kind of cell called a T cell, which gives you long-lasting immunity. Next slide. So a lot of people are worried about how fast these vaccines came out, and it makes them wonder, are the vaccines safe? Have they been tested enough? And usually vaccine producers are self-funded and they're not under much time pressure to produce a vaccine. So people have been working on vaccines, for example, against respiratory syncytial virus for the whole time I've been a doctor, since the 1980s, and we still don't have a good vaccine for that particular virus. But because the pandemic is not only killing people, but injuring our economy and our lifestyle, the government provided funds to companies so that they could develop the vaccines without any delays. And the steps of vaccine production have been known for a long time, even for mRNA vaccines, which have been under study for anti-cancer vaccine therapy. And safety and efficacy studies could also be done very quickly because this virus is all around us. And so it was really easy to get volunteers who wanted to be vaccinated. Usually that's a time-consuming process. There were high rates of infection around all those volunteers, so it was easy to tell if the people who got the vaccine versus the people who got a placebo were protected or not. So that's why these vaccines were able to be made so fast and come out so fast. Also, these messenger RNA vaccines, because they're messenger RNA, we know how to make that in the lab from the component amino acids. And so really all they had to have was the genetic code for the virus and isolate the portion for the spike protein only. And they were able to make those messenger RNA molecules pretty quickly in the lab without, having to infect chicken eggs and, do some of the other processes that other vaccines require. So that's also a reason that we'll be able to modify these vaccines if needed, because all that is needed to be modified is that messenger RNA molecule, which can be created in the lab. Next slide. So there's a new kind of vaccine out now as well called a viral vector vaccine. Both the Janssen vaccine and the AstraZeneca vaccines are non-replicating viral vector vaccines, which is a really complicated term, but it's not that complicated. So these vaccines introduce the genetic code for the spike protein into cells through a virus, but the virus is not a replicating virus, meaning the virus can't reproduce itself. All it can do is tell the cell to produce the spike protein. So it's capable of infecting your cells where you got the shot, but not of causing a generalized infection. And because it's a non-replicating virus, it eventually dies off. So instead of making millions of copies of itself, it's inducing your cells to make only copies of the spike protein. These viral vector vaccines do last longer than the mRNA in your system. And that's actually a reason that the Janssen vaccine doesn't need a booster, because your cells keep producing this spike protein over a longer period of time, up to a month. So you get the same excellent level of protection through this constant exposure to that spike protein that you would get from 2 doses of either the Pfizer or Moderna mRNA vaccines. So these 2 vaccines, the Janssen vaccine and the AstraZeneca vaccine, use 2 different adenovirus vectors. It's possible that they both only need 1 dose, but currently the AstraZeneca is being studied as a 2-dose vaccine. And more studies are being done to see, if maybe even the Janssen or Johnson & Johnson vaccine will need a 2nd dose in the future. But currently it's providing the same level of protection as the 2-dose vaccines for the mRNA vaccines with only 1 dose, which is wonderful. And actually it has fewer side effects as well. The AstraZeneca vaccine has not yet been approved in the US, and it's the one you've been hearing concerns about overseas because it's actually been used a lot in other countries. And there have been some rare reports of things like clotting disorders. And so it's not yet approved in the US. But so far it looks to be as effective as the other 3 vaccines and really as safe, although it's gotten awful lot of bad press. And so it's going to come under a lot more scrutiny before it's released here. Next slide. There we go. So how do we know a vaccine is safe? Well, we test it in large numbers of people. Large groups of people have bad outcomes, right? So every year people have heart attacks or cancer diagnoses or clots or bleeding disorders or low platelets. All these things happen in a population that's not been vaccinated. So the best way to determine if a vaccine is causing an increase in any bad outcome is to test the vaccine in large numbers of people and compare it to a large group of people that are similar in every other way, age and lifestyle and, risk factors, and see if anything happens more often in the group that was vaccinated than in the group that was not vaccinated. So individual experiences with bad outcomes are going to be things you hear about from your friends through social media or in the news. And those have happened also since these vaccines have been rolled out, but you shouldn't accept all of those as being caused by the vaccine until they are thoroughly investigated. And this set of vaccines is being more thoroughly investigated than any medication rollout, any vaccine rollout, really any medical rollout in our history. And it's being followed a number of ways. I want to go on to the next slide to kind of go over that. So there's a program that everyone who gets this vaccine can enroll in. It's a voluntary program, and it's a telephone messaging program called vSafe. So everyone who wants to be followed after getting vaccinated so that they can report even the slightest concern can enroll in this vSafe. And there are, first like daily follow-ups and then weekly follow-ups and then monthly follow-ups where the CDC contacts you to see if you're having any side effects. Plus you can give your own information back to them at any time. A lot of what is reported through VSafe also goes into the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, or VAERS. And VAERS is a passive reporting system. By that, I mean it is just accepting whatever anybody wants to report. There's no denominator. So this isn't out of all vaccines, there are these problems. It's really people just report problems. Nobody reports when they don't have a problem. And so it will have reports of things like deaths in it after any vaccine. It accepts information after any vaccine. So deaths or new diagnoses, heart attacks, anything, it can be reported into VAERS. And just as I said before, just because something is reported doesn't necessarily mean that it's caused by the vaccine. So I buckle my seatbelt every time I get in the car, but if I have a car accident, I'm not going to blame it on the fact that I just buckled my seatbelt 30 minutes before. So things that are associated in time always make us wonder and generally should be investigated. And that's the purpose of VAERS, to have people report information so that they can be investigated. So there have been, for example, over 2,000 deaths reported after COVID vaccine. And that sounds scary on the face of it, but you have to recognize we've been giving this vaccine initially to people 75 years and up. And that population is at a higher risk of death. So not every death following a COVID vaccine is due to the vaccine. A lot of them are due to the fact that people who are elderly are being vaccinated, people who are high risk because they have other conditions, medical conditions, are being vaccinated. And all of those deaths and any other serious outcome are being investigated. And to this point, they haven't discovered any deaths that they could link conclusively to the vaccine. The vast majority have been due to other morbidities or illnesses in the people who died. So those are two ways. There's also, not in orange here, but the vaccine safety data link is another method we use to track vaccine results. So some very large health systems, such as Kaiser Permanente in the US, have their patient population followed for any kind of chronic or acute illness, meaning something that happens just once or something that is a chronic or long-term illness after vaccines. And the information is included in this vaccine safety data link so that all vaccinations can be followed for rare outcomes. And over 300,000 people are included in this vaccine safety data link. And then there are other tracking systems that other countries are using to monitor for unexpected outcomes. And around the world, lots and lots of millions, really, of COVID vaccines have been given without any significant outcomes being found that should concern you. Next slide. So there are some people who should not get this vaccine. Anyone who has a severe allergy to a vaccine component, one that causes anaphylaxis, which is like swelling of your lips and tongue and throat and difficulty breathing, wheezing, any kind of immediate allergic reaction after your first dose that requires medical intervention should mean you don't get a second dose. And history of severe allergy to medications that have polysorbate or polyethylene glycol, or PEG, in it, those individuals should also not get this vaccine, or not get the mRNA vaccines, because those contain PEG or polysorbate. So it's possible that individuals with that second category of severe allergies might be able to get the Janssen vaccine without any problems, because it does not contain the polysorbate or PEG. And those younger than 16 years of age currently are not able to get the vaccine. Next slide. So what things are in the vaccine? So if you're worried about allergies, so the things that are in these vaccines are messenger RNA for the messenger RNA vaccines, DNA for the spike protein only for the viral vector vaccines, lipids, which are fats, and those little fat bubbles are basically protecting the messenger RNA. For the adenovirus vector vaccines, those are those non-replicating viral vectors that sneak the DNA into the cell to make spike proteins. And then salts and amines are basically to keep the vaccine stable and also keep the pH similar to the pH of your body so the vaccine doesn't damage cells when it's administered. And then there's some other things off to the side. The acetic acid is for stabilization and for pH, and sucrose just keeps the fat bubbles from sticking to the vial. Next slide. Things that are not in the vaccines, there are no antibiotics. So if you have an antibiotic allergy, that's not a problem. There are no blood products. There are no preservatives like thimerosal, and that's why the vaccines have to be used within a certain number of hours after being opened. There's no gluten or egg proteins or pork products or microchips. Next slide. So among the people who should not get vaccinated are people who shouldn't get vaccinated for other reasons. And that is basically people who have COVID and are isolating and experiencing those symptoms should not be vaccinated. They need to be vaccinated once they're finished isolation and their symptoms have resolved. There were restrictions on who could get the vaccine until the end of March. And as of March 25th, everyone age 16 and up now can get the COVID vaccine, and the supplies are increasing. We are still prioritizing those at highest risk. So those 85 and up or those with serious comorbid conditions certainly need to be vaccinated before the 20-year-olds and some of the healthy young adults. But everyone can get vaccinated now, and everyone should get themselves put on a wait list. There are some individuals who may have special concerns about getting the vaccine, and top on that list is pregnant or breastfeeding women. The only vaccines that have ever been shown to be problematic for pregnant or breastfeeding women are live virus vaccines, and none of these vaccines are live viruses. The live virus vaccines, again, are weakened viruses, but they still cause an infection, and those infections can cause infection in a fetus. And really, really rarely, the yellow fever vaccine can cause an infection in a breastfeeding infant, meaning there has been one case report. that vaccine has been around for a long, long time. There are people with certain immune system conditions who will worry about vaccination. So if people have AIDS or they're on chronic steroids, their immune systems don't work very well. Perhaps they're on other medications for rheumatoid arthritis and other conditions that the medications can like reduce their immune system responsiveness. Methotrexate would be a medicine like that. They may not develop good immunity to the vaccine, but that is not a contraindication to being vaccinated. So people with that kind of immune system compromise should get vaccinated, but they should be aware that they are possibly not going to get the best protection even once they're vaccinated twice. And those who have immune system problems where their immune system fights themselves, for example, juvenile onset diabetes or rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, those sorts of conditions actually have been studied, and it has not been evident that the vaccines cause any flare-ups of those kinds of illnesses or any problems. So people with autoimmune conditions should go ahead and get vaccinated. We do want you to enroll in VSafe. We do want you to, report if you have a flare-up of some kind, because so far we're not seeing any evidence that the vaccines are causing any flare-ups, but we would want to know about that. And so we need people to report that if that happens to them. But they were studied in the trials, and now that millions of doses have been given, we are not seeing any problems with flare-ups among that subset of individuals. And then when you read the information sheet, there's some information on there about people on anticoagulants may want to talk about it with their doctor. And that's really because when you get an injection and you're on an anticoagulant, you're likely to get some bruising or even bleeding at the injection site that's a little bit more than the average person would get. It is not likely to cause any problems for you. And that subset of people are also being studied, in particular in Europe, in regard to the AstraZeneca vaccine, and they don't seem to be any more likely to have problems with clotting or other issues after that AstraZeneca vaccine. So we'll know more about that later. And again, that vaccine's not even available here. Next slide. People who do have a history of severe allergy, for example, they've had anaphylaxis to bee stings or to certain foods, they can get the vaccine, but they should plan to wait at the vaccination center for 30 minutes after getting the shot. And that's really because they might have an allergy to PEG or polysorbate without knowing it. If you have a history of severe allergy to one kind of protein, for example, bee stings, it's possible that your body will develop that same kind of strong response to other proteins. And PEG and polysorbate are in a lot of over-the-counter laxatives and other over-the-counter medications. So we want anybody who has a history of severe allergy, anybody who carries an EpiPen, anybody who's had serious issues with hives and wheezing after any kind of medication or food or shot should wait for 30 minutes after they get the COVID vaccine. Pregnant women who develop a fever after vaccination should take some Tylenol. We know that high fevers in pregnant women can cause problems with the developing fetus, particularly in early pregnancy. And then people who have recently had COVID and were treated with antibody therapies like monoclonal antibodies or with plasma should wait until 90 days after the treatment before they get vaccinated, because we don't want those antibodies to neutralize the vaccine. People who recently had COVID and were not treated with the antibody therapies have already developed their own antibodies to the spike protein, more than likely. And because they're their own antibodies, they won't interfere with a response to the vaccine, but the vaccine will boost their response. So people who've recently had COVID can wait up to 90 days before they get vaccinated. They don't have to wait. We do want them to get vaccinated to make sure that their immunity is long-lived. Next slide. Let's see, people who had a known exposure, again, should wait until their quarantine is over, unless they live in a group setting like a nursing home or a correctional facility, and that just happens to be vaccination day in that facility. Then they don't need to wait. They can be vaccinated because the people doing the vaccinations in those sorts of facilities will be wearing protective gear. And people who got another vaccine should wait 14 days before getting the COVID vaccine, and also wait 14 days after they get the COVID vaccine before they get another vaccine. And the only reason for that is because if you have some sort of questionable health outcome after vaccination, we want to be able to know which vaccine might have caused it when we do our investigation. So this is not an absolute, if you forgot to tell somebody, or maybe it was 13 days or whatever, it's okay to go ahead and get the COVID, but we're trying to get people to space it out. So if there's a side effect, for example, fever, we can know which vaccine to blame it on. And this does not apply for other kinds of injections. So if you're getting a B12 injection, or you're getting a contraceptive injection or something, then you don't have to wait 14 days before you get the COVID vaccine. Next slide. The most common side effects from these vaccines, all of not only the mRNA, but also the viral vector vaccines, are fatigue, fever, headache, muscle aches. And the mRNA vaccines tend to cause swollen glands in the armpit and more of a local reaction on your arm. So sometimes that local reaction doesn't happen immediately, but 3 to 5 days later, you get this big red patch on your arm, and it can last for a couple of weeks. Those local reactions are your immune system taking notice of this spike protein. And that's what the fever and fatigue are about as well. Most of the time, it's a day or two of symptoms, not really likely to keep you out of work more than one day, and really not so much with the first dose as with the second dose. So the second dose is a booster dose, and your body is already primed to respond to this spike protein. So there have been more side effects after the second dose than the first. And so you may want to have that second dose towards the weekend so that you don't have to go to work the next day. But again, these side effects are really relatively mild, and certainly much milder than a COVID illness, and much less likely to cause you any problems than a COVID illness would. So get the vaccine. Next slide. So far, all of the vaccines are proving to be as effective as they were in the clinical trials, with nearly 100% protection from hospitalization and death, starting 2 weeks after the second dose, or really 4 to 5 weeks after the Janssen single dose. And that's really important to understand. There have been some comparisons between the vaccines about how much they prevent any illness or asymptomatic illness or mild illness, and those numbers vary. But the Janssen vaccine, in particular, was tested in populations that had a lot of these viral variants going around, whereas the two mRNA vaccines were tested really just on the initial COVID-19 virus and not with the variants. That they are all showing that the variants can still cause an infection after vaccination, but usually it's really quite mild. And you are still 100% protected from hospitalization and death with any of these vaccines. Even with the variants, your protection is very, very good. So really don't go. We've had people at Kelsey that have said, oh, I don't want to get the Janssen vaccine because it was 72% effective versus 80% protective for the mRNA vaccines. And really that is a false comparison, because of the populations that were used in those initial tests were different. So Janssen was tested in Brazil, it was tested in South Africa, it was tested in populations with these variants. So the important thing is we're not trying to, we like to prevent all illness, but if all you're getting are a few cold symptoms and you're not particularly contagious to other people, that's not a concern. What's a concern about this virus is it going to kill you? Is it going to put you in the hospital for months? Is it going to cause long-term COVID symptoms that will last for months and months? And all of the vaccines protect you equally well. So get the first vaccine that you're offered. Don't delay your vaccination because of a preference for one kind of vaccine over another. Get your vaccine as soon as you are offered it. Sign up for vaccination lists. Whatever health system you are in is where you should try and sign up to get vaccinated. So the efficacy is so good for these vaccines that if people are 2 weeks out from their second dose of the mRNA vaccine, or even 2 weeks out from the Janssen vaccine, they do not need to quarantine if they're exposed. And new studies out in the last 2 weeks have also shown that vaccinated people are very unlikely to have asymptomatic infections or carry infection to other people, even the variants. Next slide. So that kind of answers this slide. Does the mutation of the virus affect the capacity to prevent disease? And it does affect the capacity to prevent mild disease, but it is not affecting the capacity of these vaccines to prevent serious illness. Some of the mutations are both more serious when you get them and more contagious to other people. And what these mutations really are, if you think about the spike protein as a key and the receptor on your cells called the ACE receptor as a lock, the original protein, the key fit the lock, but it kind of had to be jiggled to work. These variants fit the lock much more tightly. They're nice and snug. They turn immediately. They get that lock open, and the virus is then able to infect the cell. So what that means is because the viruses don't fall out of the lock, it takes fewer viruses to cause an infection because they all attach more easily. It also takes fewer viruses to make you seriously ill. So if you only get a few viruses, your body may be able to clear them. But if you get, thousands or millions of viruses in your system, then your body has a harder time clearing it. And if all of those thousands or millions of viruses can attach more effectively, then you get much sicker as well, because more of your cells are infected and more of them have been hijacked to produce more virus. And it's more likely to get down lower in your respiratory tree and cause more pneumonia, for example. So it's really about how these viruses attach to your cells and what that spike protein looks like. The coronavirus is likely to stay with us long term, like flu viruses do. We already have had long-term coronaviruses in our populations. Coronaviruses are the common cold virus. This one just happens to be a coronavirus that is very adapted to latch onto our cells and to open that lock to get into the cell. And so as these viruses have mutated to fit the lock better, it's going to be harder and harder to eliminate them from humankind. So we're past the point where, locking down Wuhan or any other city is going to really, enable us to prevent the rest of the world from getting it. This virus is around the world. There are unimmunized people, either by choice or because they're too young to be immunized or because they have no access to vaccine. And so these viruses are going to continue to circulate in humankind. And the good news is that we have the vaccine technology now to update the vaccines as needed. So the mRNA vaccines and the viral vector vaccines can be modified to make a different spike protein, one that is more like whatever variant is going around. That's not necessary yet, but it's certainly being studied by all these companies. And if the virus mutates enough to where we need a booster shot of a slightly different spike protein, we will all be able to get that. It's really, really important for as many people to be vaccinated as possible to stop these hard to say these words, to stop these viral variants from cropping up. The more the virus infects people, the more times it reproduces itself. And it's faulty reproduction that actually causes the variation in their DNA. And it's the variation in their DNA that can make the protein fit our receptor on our cells better. The good news is that those faulty replications are actually mostly fatal to the virus. So most of the variants that don't make the virus more fit to infect us will actually die out. But the ones that do become more fit and able to infect us will keep cropping up as long as we have a lot of people who are susceptible to this virus and who are getting infected. So we really need to recognize that everyone around the world needs to be vaccinated as quickly as possible in order to protect all of us, because this is going to continue on and on. And we want to stop it. And I've really already talked about this next slide. So you can go ahead and skip over this one. Don't think I've got any other new information to say on that. Once you're vaccinated, do you pose a risk to unvaccinated family members? And you not by being vaccinated, for certain, because the mRNA vaccines are not live viruses. So the vaccinated person is not going to carry any vaccine to other family members. We do have vaccines like nasal flu vaccine, which actually may protect other people in the household because they may inadvertently catch it because it's a live virus vaccine, but these are not live virus vaccines. So you're not going to spread anything infectious to other people once you're vaccinated. And as early as 2 weeks after the first dose, and certainly by 2 weeks from the second dose or 4 weeks from the Janssen vaccine, you are extremely unlikely to have asymptomatic infections or to infect others, except that you still probably could transfer the virus on your hands. So the frequent hand washing and social distancing and mask wearing are all still an effective way of protecting family members. There's a fear among public health officials that we are already letting the cat out of the bag a little too soon by removing mask mandates and and sort of assuming that because we have a lot of vaccine around that we're not going to suffer the consequences. The majority of our population is not yet vaccinated and has not yet developed immunity to illness. So it's really important to continue to wear the mask, which is the next slide. We want to decrease the chance of introducing the virus in the home through carriage on our hands, and to maintain this community standard. We all used to think it was really funny to see people in masks in China until this virus came around. And we've grown accustomed to wearing masks everywhere. And that community acceptance of masking has really benefited us in ways that the media is not much talking about. We basically have not had a flu season, and we haven't had a bronchiolitis season or a croup season or any of those respiratory viruses that spread in the wintertime that cause so many other illnesses, simply because we've been masking and washing hands and social distancing. And again, we have a huge proportion of the population that's not yet vaccinated. And among the people who are vaccinated, we have some of those people with immune compromise who might not get a good response to the vaccine. And we really need to keep the masking and hand washing and social distancing up until we get 70–80% of the population vaccinated. You can safely enlarge your home bubble to others who are vaccinated and are out from their vaccines 2 weeks. And you won't be a danger to those who are at high risk. So if you're vaccinated and you want to visit somebody who's a high risk person who has not yet been vaccinated, you're not likely to be a danger to them. You can visit your grandkids if you're the high risk person and you've been vaccinated and you're 2 weeks out. But please continue to wear your mask when you're around unvaccinated people, particularly those at high risk, and to help keep this social norm of masking going at least another month or two, or even longer if we have a lot more variants. Let's see. We now know that if you are, you can be in an interior space with people who are vaccinated, if everybody's vaccinated, that's safe. And you don't have to limit the size of that grouping as long as everybody's 2 weeks out and everybody's vaccinated. And that's why people are talking about things like, electronic vaccine identification cards. I know that this is a controversial topic about, who needs to know that I'm vaccinated or whatever, or will that lead to discrimination? The truth is that we have had international vaccine cards for yellow fever for decades. And as long as I've been a physician, in the 80s, we've had those international vaccine cards. And really, this is a way of protecting our community to be able to verify that people have either had a negative test or have had a vaccine in order to protect group gatherings. And so that's getting a lot of pushback. It's not something that's mandated anywhere. But for example, if you want to go on a cruise, you're going to feel a lot safer if that cruise line requires that everybody on the cruise has been vaccinated, that rather than if they don't require that, right? Because you're going to be sharing the same spaces with people and you won't know them and you won't know their history. So I think that this is a sensible public health thing to do. The CDC and a lot of governments are kind of dancing around it because there's a lot of opposition to the idea that it might cause, people to be discriminated against because they haven't been vaccinated or that they can't be vaccinated. But what it really is going to do is it's going to make life safer and help us get back to normal. The risk of it causing any kind of discrimination is really much less. If you don't want people to be worried about being around you, then get vaccinated. Or if you are one of those very few people who can't get vaccinated, get tested frequently. So either way, and wearing the mask and doing your social distancing, any of those things will help us all get back to normal sooner. Okay, next slide. We estimate that about 7 or 8 out of every 10 people will need to be immune to control this virus. And given just in the US population, that means 250 million of us need to be immune. And that includes the children, right? So the children can't get the vaccine, so they're only getting immunity by being sick at this point. If we had to rely on infections alone to stop the spread of COVID-19, we would probably get up somewhere between 1 million and 5.4 million people having died from this virus to get that level of immunity. Fortunately, we have vaccines and we don't have to rely on infections alone. And so I encourage you to think about that figure when you're trying to decide, if you're nervous about getting the vaccine and you're trying to decide, you don't want to be one of those people who dies because you are more afraid of the vaccine than the illness. Next slide. And travel. Fortunately, we're now starting to see some loosening of travel concerns. If travel does increase the risk of spreading variants around the globe that can't be prevented or that might not be prevented with vaccination. So again, the current vaccines are preventing infection with the variant or preventing serious illness with the variants, not all illness with the variants, but travel, people moving from place to place, particularly people who are not vaccinated moving place to place, is going to increase the spread of these variants. And the more the variants spread, the more they are going to mutate and newer variants are going to come out. Vaccinated travelers are safer themselves when they travel. And it's safer for the community than somebody who's not vaccinated, but you still could catch a variant and bring it home and spread it and just be less symptomatic. So we should avoid travel when possible, especially to areas where there are new variants of concern, like Brazil and now India and United Kingdom and South Africa. But those variants are in our country as well. And so continue to practice your good hygiene. And then I think the next slide on mine still shows this graph on, the vaccine supply. So fortunately, we're now at this upsurge in this sort of teal color where we have a lot more increase in our doses per week that are available to use for vaccinating. And you can see from this that initially that was going to be phase 1C, where, we still had restrictions on who can get the vaccine. And all of our government entities have put us into phase 2, where everyone who wants to get vaccinated can be vaccinated. And we are in April 2021. So you can see we were about to do that anyway, according to the estimates of when vaccines would come out. But the reason I have this slide here is just to mention that just because the government says now everybody can be vaccinated doesn't mean that there are enough vaccine doses for everyone yet. And so the vaccine supply has increased dramatically. We at Kelsey-Seybold are finally getting large amounts of vaccine and giving it out as fast as we can do it. But we are still doing that by sending scheduling tickets to people and working on our highest risk people and we're allowing everyone who wants one to get it, but we're still most concerned about those who are at the highest risk of dying from this illness, which would be the older population and those with high risk conditions. So I expect that pretty much everyone will be able to get a vaccine by the end of summer, even though right now, supposedly everybody could get a vaccine. It's just that the supply is still restricting. And my next slide is really just a list of some good resources that you can go get information. I took that last slide from Vaccinate Your Family. They have a lot of good COVID vaccine information on their website, as does the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia Vaccine Education Center, from which a lot of the information on my slideshow came. And the CDC is really your best source for specific information about specific things like when can your church reopen and how can you host a large event safely, and that kind of information is all on the CDC website as well. So questions?
All right, we have quite a few questions that have come in. I know lots of them came in at the beginning. A few in the chat section and the Q&A section were about FDA approval. Can you speak a little bit more about what that process is, what the emergency use authorization is, just so we have a bit more background information about FDA approval?
Okay, so FDA approval generally is a pretty slow process, and none of the vaccines that are in current use have complete FDA approval. And FDA approval requires, basically, it's a more of a bureaucratic process, but it often requires even a longer period of following people. So what's been shortened, the steps of vaccine production, the steps of safety testing have all been done, but the following people for 2 years to find out were there any side effects 2 years out, for example, that's not been done. And so that's why these are emergency use authorizations rather than full approval. So the EUA basically says, this is better than the alternative. We don't, there's nothing else on the market that would work. It is a public health emergency. We are authorizing these vaccines to be used in this emergency because the available data, while we don't have 2 years or 5 years worth of follow-up data, the available data shows that these vaccines are safe and that they're effective. And because these vaccines were allowed to roll out under these EUA criteria, we actually have much more data in a short period of time than we've ever had on other vaccines because of those programs like Be Safe and VAERS that are following outcomes. So again, we've got millions of doses rolled out in populations around the globe that are all being followed. And so, for example, other vaccines like meningitis vaccines or human papillomavirus vaccines, really the COVID vaccines have been given to comparable numbers of people as some of the vaccines that we've had for 5 years or 10 years. So while it's still an EUA, that's really because we haven't followed it for a number of years after they came out to get that FDA approval. But it's not because they're less safe. And in fact, the number of people who've gotten this vaccine have really proven that they are safe.
All right, we have a few more questions that came in regarding your immune system and vaccines. First question would be, how does the vaccine affect your immune system? And then the second question is related to taking Tylenol or any other anti-inflammatory medication before receiving your vaccine.
Okay, so I'm going to answer the second one first. There's studies in pediatric populations that kids who are given Tylenol or ibuprofen before they get their vaccine in anticipation of fever or achiness or irritability after the vaccine, those children actually get slightly lower antibody or immune response levels on testing later, blood testing. And so nobody's done that study in adults, but the evidence is strong enough that the CDC recommends that you not pre-medicate yourself with Tylenol or ibuprofen because we want you to get a good immune response. We don't want that immune response blunted by these medications, which are anti-inflammatory medications. Anti-inflammatory medications actually dampen your immune response. Steroids are the strongest class of anti-inflammatory medications, and they can really wipe out your immune system if you're on high doses for a long period of time. But these over-the-counter anti-inflammatories kind of reduce some of the response that your whole immune system that your whole immune system uses to develop a good response. That didn't come out sounding right, but basically you need your whole immune system to coordinate its efforts to develop immunity. Part of your development of immunity involves having a fever, for example. That actually stimulates your immune response. So we don't want you to prevent the fever. But if you're feeling achy, if you're having a fever, if you really feel lousy, we don't also want you to be afraid of taking the Tylenol or the ibuprofen afterwards. Go ahead and let yourself get a little headache, let yourself get a little low-grade fever, treat it after you get it, because it's actually kind of prodding your immune system into activity. Now, how the vaccine works with your immune system, basically, most infections are a bacteria that is, infecting a localized area of your body, say your tonsils or your sinuses or whatever. And those develop an immune response by coming in contact with cells that recognize their foreign protein and then attract white blood cells to the area, and that creates pus. So bacterial infections tend to be localized and cause pus. Viral infections are different. Viral infections, actually, the virus injects itself into the cell. It latches onto a cell with a receptor, and then it injects its DNA into the cell, and it takes over the cell. So the cell eventually is going to die because it's been invaded by this virus, and it takes over the cellular machinery to make millions of more copies of the virus, and then those circulate through your body and make your more of your cells get infected. And so viral illnesses give you sort of a whole body, I feel bad kind of response, instead of my sore throat or my cough or my sinus infection. So when you're sort of sick all over, that's usually a virus. And the way our immune system gets stimulated by those viruses is basically those proteins floating around eventually come in contact with certain B and T cells in our immune system that make antibodies. And the antibodies are kind of like, they attach to that spike protein. They recognize the protein and they tag the virus itself as an invader. And then it's cleared by other cells in your lymph nodes and in your spleen. So that's pretty complicated, but but we fight the two types of infections differently. We fight bacterial infections with white blood cells that eat the bacteria, and we fight viruses with a different type of white blood cell that produces antibodies and tags them for removal.
Okay, let's scroll down. We have another. Do we know how long the vaccine protections will last, and does it differ between Janssen, Moderna, Pfizer, and do we know if we will need boosters regularly yet?
So that's a great question. This virus has only been around for a year and a half, and so, or not even a year and a half, but somewhere around that figure. So we don't know how long the immunity from the vaccine or even the immunity from the illness will last. We know that people who've had COVID don't get a second infection with COVID for about 90 days. But after about 90 days, there are people who get second infections, usually with a variant. And so we know that natural immunity is not long-lived. And that's why we want people with history of COVID to go ahead and get a vaccine. What makes the vaccine immunity long-lived is because it stimulates certain kinds of T cells in your immune system that the natural infection may not be stimulating as effectively. We won't know for a number of years how long this protection lasts. And part of it will be, we get an annual flu shot because the flu virus is mutating. So, and our immunity to the virus we were already vaccinated with is actually probably pretty good. But since the virus itself has changed, our immunity is not so good against the new form of the flu virus. So if this coronavirus mutates a lot, we'll need more vaccines against it, and the vaccines will be modified to be effective. If it doesn't mutate a lot, if we get it under control, enough people get vaccinated, we stop producing a lot of variants, then we won't need boosters, or at least we won't need them as often. Given the rate that this virus is mutating, we already have 4 main mutations in the course of about a year and a half that the vaccines still work against. I'm guessing that we'll probably need a booster about every 5 years against something that's a variant from the original one. probably if it doesn't do a lot more mutating and the vaccines continue to be effective against all the mutants, it could be as long as 10 years. I don't think it's going to be an every year vaccine because this virus is not mutating as fast as flu viruses. And so far the immunity caused by the vaccines is still effective.
So here's a question that came in about treating COVID. Now that it's been around for over a year, are doctors becoming more effective and more efficient in treating COVID? And what are the most common therapies that are being used to treat COVID?
So definitely we're learning by experience. And I'm not speaking for myself because I don't actually treat COVID. So I do know that many things that have been found to be effective have been sort of trial and error. For example, placing patients on their stomach and delaying introduction of a ventilator longer. So those things have been shown to be effective, and they were sort of trial and error that came about. The more patients you treat, the more you figure out, how to help people effectively. The convalescent plasma and the monoclonal antibodies are very effective. And the monoclonal antibodies, remdesivir and others, those are lab-produced antibodies, and convalescent plasma is antibodies from people who've already had the infection. So they're very similar ways of treating. And we know that getting antibody infusions, if you're a high-risk person, you're already infected with COVID, but you're really at high risk of getting very sick and being hospitalized, we know that those antibody infusions can keep you out of the hospital and can help you recover faster. So at Kelsey-Seybold, we can do as many as 12 a day of those antibody infusions, and we, are really careful to, try and get the right population in for those. They're not for everybody. They're not a cheap treatment, and they, once you're already really, really sick, they're less effective. So they're really better as a way of curbing an illness that's already started before it gets serious.
Perfect. Sorry, my computer keeps cutting in and out a little bit here. The last question we have for today is about the efficacy of the vaccine for those who are, immune suppressed. Is there any data or evidence that the vaccine is more or less effective for that population?
Yes, there is. So in each of the vaccine studies, they did include people who had immune suppression from a variety of causes. People who had AIDS, people who were on steroids for asthma, people who had immune suppression from cancer or cancer therapies. And the vaccines were shown to be effective in those populations. It's just as a whole, we kind of know as a whole that it's effective in those populations. But if you separate that population out from everybody else who were in the trials, it's slightly less. So it's not quite as good as if your immune system's working. And there haven't been enough segregated causes. Like, we can't really compare somebody with AIDS versus somebody who's been on high dose steroids for 2 years, to know which of those two are going to respond better to the vaccine. But what is clear is that your response to the vaccine is going to be much better than your response to a natural infection, and you should get vaccinated and basically hope for the best. But it really looks like this vaccine is so strong in producing immunity that you'll do pretty well. The people who might not do well are the people who are already terribly debilitated. So somebody who's on cancer chemotherapy and is already weak with low white blood cells and, is wearing a mask pre-COVID because of how their immune system is really weakened, those people are less likely to respond well. So, you need to kind of individualize your decision on when you get vaccinated with your doctor if you're in that kind of situation. There are some immune suppressing medications that can be stopped for a couple of weeks without much consequence to people. And so stopping the medication, waiting a couple of weeks, then getting vaccinated, waiting a couple more weeks, and then restarting your medication is an option for some people whose immune suppression is related to medication. And again, that's something to discuss with your doctor.
Perfect. Okay, we'll take one last question. I know we're hitting an hour mark here today. So if you are pregnant, are there any differences in getting the Pfizer vaccine versus the Moderna vaccine or the Janssen vaccine? And what about the timing relative to baby's due date or delivery date?
So virtually all of the specialists in pregnancy, the American Society of Neonatologists and Perinatologists, and all of the groups, the OB-GYN associations, have really encouraged pregnant women to get this vaccine, regardless of which trimester they're in. We know that spontaneous abortions occur most in the first trimester. And so we know, and that's without any vaccine. So we know if you get it in the first trimester and you have a spontaneous abortion, that will concern you. And so you might want to wait to the second trimester if you're really concerned about that. But it really, no vaccine has been shown to increase the number of spontaneous miscarriages. So any trimester is fine to get it. We know from other maternal immunizations that getting a vaccine between about 27 and 36 weeks that's the best time for immunity to transfer to the baby. So somewhere between 27 and 36 weeks is a great time to get vaccinated, for example, for flu and for whooping cough, because of the immunity that will transfer to the baby. But this virus is really serious in pregnant women and can cause pregnant women to die. So we don't really want you waiting just because of that benefit to the baby, because your baby will get some of your immunity regardless, even if you get it in the first trimester. So my message to pregnant and breastfeeding women is get it as soon as you're offered it. And no, there's no real advantage of one form of the vaccine versus others. Really, the vaccines stay in your arm and your lymphatic system in that region, and they aren't going to travel to your placenta or to your infant or through your breast milk. So it's something that is being followed with the VSafe app. Many healthcare workers are pregnant or breastfeeding and have elected to be followed with the VSafe app. And so far, there are no signals like increased number of miscarriages, increase in premature birth, increase in birth complications or congenital issues like malformations or syndromes or anything. So far, it's really been shown to be safe, and I would encourage you to get it.
Wonderful. Dr. Mouzoon, thank you so much for the time you spent with us today and sharing all the information and answering questions that were submitted from everyone who tuned in. We really appreciate it. For those of you who are new to CareConnect Convos, we will be having another CareConnect Convo on April 21st with Dr. Desiree Thomas, a neurologist here at Kelsey-Seybold. She'll be talking about migraines and treatment, possible changes to your lifestyle for prevention of migraines, and answering any questions that come in during that time that she can about headaches and migraines in patients at Kelsey. So if you'd like to join us, feel free to pop on over to Kelsey-Seybold's website at kelsey-seybold.com. On the top right hand of your screen, there's an About section. You can scroll down to events and see all of our upcoming events we have. A recording of this event with Dr. Mouzoon will also be posted on our CareConnect Convos website and shared on social media. So if you'd like to reference it in the future, you can head on over to our website and look, or our social media pages, and look for it there as well. So thank you again, Dr. Mouzoon, and everyone else who joined us, and we hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.